Hi, welcome back to Follet, the video book. I realize that I haven't given you anything exactly stimulating for the last couple of installments, but stories are a lot like life. A lot of times you just have a lot of exposition and advancing of the plot, and at other times the details are intense and unforgettable, and you'd like them to go on forever, and sometimes they do for a while. But then you get exposition again. But realizing that you probably missed a little bit of the stuff that makes you coming back. And we're at that point in the story where there's going to be some of that. I must warn you once again that this particular little video snippet is not safe for work or children. Nope, nope, nope. Don't even think about it. Nope. So if you must leave us now, we'll see you next time when it's a little cooler and calmer, and we've got our heads screwed on a little more tightly. So, if you're ready and you're comfortable, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Here we go. Follet drove north through the underpass for the highway until he came to, he laughed out loud when he saw it, Lover's Lane. The call pulled him to the left. He drove a mile or so, and the houses began to thin out. He pulled to the side of the street and parked under a gigantic white oak whose canopy hung above the street like a cathedral ceiling. It was easily 100 feet tall and its trunk 4 or 5 feet in diameter. Follet felt its age. It had been growing since before the Europeans had come to this place. The call was getting stronger. Follet locked the car and walked west. He saw the little gray house and knew the dreamer was there. He walked up to the front door. He looked all around him and saw that the street was deserted. It was midday, and all of the neighbors must have been at work, but not this dreamer. He passed through the front door, a little front room to the left, a short hallway straight ahead that ended in a linoleum-floored and countered kitchen, stairs to his right. He ghosted up the stairs and discovered a bathroom at the top of the stairs and then a half-open door into a bedroom. He stuck his head through the doorway and saw her, asleep on the bed. There was a closet door next to an inexpensive dresser topped with a mirror, with a jewelry box and 4 framed photographs in metal frames flanking the box. There was a tiny gold heart-shaped frame that held a black and white snapshot of a man and a woman, sitting as if for a portrait, dressed in their go-to-meeting clothes. The woman's parents, Follet thought. Next to that was a tiny square silver frame with a 6/21/90 engraved on the bottom of the frame, holding a black and white photo of a mop-haired little girl. On the other side of the box were 2 larger color photographs framed in silvery pressed tin rectangular frames. One of the woman who was asleep in the bed with a bearded young man standing behind her, his arms wrapped loosely around her waist, and the other of the young man waving from the cab of what looked to Follet like a Kenworth W900, like in the Bond movie License to Kill. Then Follet looked on the wall next to the dresser and saw a cross-stitched sampler framed in rough wood, with the saying, "For the good old American life, for the money, for the glory, and for the fun," mostly for the money, Bandit. And he was certain that it was a W900. To the right of the dresser was a wall of house with a 4-pane window filled with light just above a big, comfy, overstuffed dark green armchair. Then a small wooden bedside table and the double bed where the woman slept. Her uniform from work was tossed on the armchair, her sensible shoes thrown randomly on the floor. She lay face down, her right arm folded beneath her and her left arm flung out, hanging over the edge of the bed, on a white tufted hobnail chenille bedspread, and wore only black and white cotton tie-dyed knee-high socks and white cotton reef panties. Her hair was long to her shoulders and black. Follet walked over to the armchair, sat down, and waited for the dream. It did not take long before the floor began to turn to mist and the edges of solid objects lost their definition. Follet found that he was suddenly holding a large gilt-edged leather-bound book in his now naked lap. And now standing in front of the bed and now walking effortlessly and serenely toward him, her eyes taking his, wearing nothing but the black and white tie-dyed knee socks, was the woman. Her straight black hair was long in the back and short on top, parted on the right, looking almost like a horse's mane. Her legs and arms were thin and long, her breasts small with brown aureoles and long nipples just beginning to harden. Thin, straight hair sparsely covered her moans. She walked to Follet and leaned over him before arranging herself in his lap. He moved the book to let her throw her legs over the arm of the chair. She put her right arm behind his back, and her hand touched his right shoulder. Her left hand lay, fingers splayed, on his chest. Follet turned his face to hers and was struck, almost mesmerized, by her cadet gray eyes. She smiled and looked deeply into his eyes, and her pupils dilated, opening to him. "Read me a story," she breathed. Follet began. Once upon a time, not so far away, there was a teacher and his student. They would meet twice a week in a small classroom tucked away in the back of the art building. The place smelled vaguely of turpentine and oil paint, and the walls were cinder block covered in a neutral light brown paint. The classroom had an office-style wooden desk, probably oak, with a wooden armchair and two 30-year-old student desks. The student would come to class promptly at 6, and the teacher would be there sitting at the desk writing on his white legal pad. The student never saw what the teacher wrote, but the teacher stopped his scribbling and put the pad away in his green canvas backpack as soon as the student entered the room. The classroom had a screen that pulled down from the ceiling and a computer projector. The projector was hooked up to a Macintosh laptop with 4 unexpectedly large speakers mounted to the wall and a massive subwoofer hidden under the desk. There was always music playing when the student entered the room, but each time they met, the music was different. Sometimes it was harp music, alternating between the floating melodies of Alice Coltrane and the reeling formality of old Celtic Clarsach Schulberg. Sometimes it was original cast recordings of Broadway show tunes like South Pacific, or Owsley Stanley soundboard recordings of the Grateful Dead, and sometimes it alternated between Duke Ellington's sophisticated swing, Johnny Burnett's rolling rockabilly, Chester Burnett's howling blues, or Ralph Stanley's propulsive clawhammer banjo. The only constant was the exquisite perfection of the music itself. The student and the teacher would talk about the task at hand, writing. Sometimes they would read the works of great writers. He liked Faulkner and Melville and William Burroughs and Terry Pratchett. The student listened, and the two of them shared the wonderful words together. The student found that, as she and the teacher worked together, her heart would beat faster and her skin would warm to his words. She also found that when their discussion became especially passionate, she would become aroused. At first this bothered her. She didn't want these feelings. But the more they worked together, the more she found that she wanted to feel this way all the time. She would look at his face, and when he was lost in the reverie of words and trace the line of his lips with her eyes, her gaze would travel down his neck to the button-down shirt that covered his chest, down to his pants, where she was sure she could just make out the curving bulge of his penis. She looked away when she realized what she had done, but then she looked again. He spoke about the art of creation, building ideas with words, and she saw he was becoming aroused too. He continued with his thoughts, and his eyes fell upon her. Today she was wearing a white cotton button-down shirt, a Sir Walter Scott modern black and white tartan kilt, held with a kilt pin made from an antler, the same black and white tie-dyed knee socks that her sleeping self wore, and black patent leather platform-heeled loafers with taller flared heels and D-rings, strung with cords tying over the vamp of the shoe and at the heel. She was beautiful, but he was attracted by her thoughts as well. He looked at her, and his gaze fell from her eyes, to her mouth, to her shirt. She noticed this and slowly moved her hand up to cradle her chin, and then she moved it down, fingertips gently brushing her breast and feeling her nipple harden at the fleeting touch of her hand. In the distance a bell tolled the hour, and the teacher took his eyes off the now hard nub of flesh, pushing at the fabric of her blouse, coughed and said, "Same time on Friday?" She wanted to say more, but she nodded. As she moved to leave the classroom, her back to him, he said, "Wait." She stopped, not turning around, and he moved up behind her. He slid his hand around her waist, slipping 3 of his fingers through the spaces between the buttons to touch her belly. She sighed and leaned back into him. He moved her hair away from her soft neck, and his lips found her. She whispered, "I've wanted you for so long." and his hand moved from her belly up to her breast, kneading the soft flesh under the fabric. His mouth left her neck, and she turned her face to him, and they kissed, probing and gently sucking and almost inhaling each other. She tried to turn to face him, but he held her tightly. She feverishly worked at unbuttoning her shirt, and when her shirt was loosened, she took her hand and placed it on her warm roundness, pushing his hand to knead her there, taking her nipple between his fingers, pulling at it. Follet felt the dreamer move her hand to touch, as gently as a breeze, the skin on his back, and the hand she touched to his chest wound its fingers through the curly hair there, tracing symbols and patterns he did not know. She moved her lips to almost touch his earlobe. He could feel the warm, moist air from her mouth flowing over the fleshy lobe, and then he could feel her lips, wet and soft, touching him there, slightly parting and closing around him. She gently sucked his flesh into her, his skin sliding past her slick lips. Almost imperceptibly, softly, and deliberately, she took her mouth from his earlobe and whispered, "Don't stop," and then closed her lips around him again. He read. She pushed her ass into the hardness trapped in his jeans, and the two of them half stumbled across the room until they ran into the teacher's desk. Still kissing, he took his hand away from her nipple and loosened his belt, unbuttoned his jeans, and let them fall to the floor. His cock was hard and hot, and he needed to be inside her. He grabbed for her skirt and pushed it up, baring the back of her thighs and the pink panties that covered her ass. He tore at her panties, pulling them down, and then she reached down to pull them past her thighs so that they too could fall to the floor. He threw her skirt up over her waist, exposing her beautiful thighs and ass. She reached for the chair next to the desk and pulled it close so that she could place her foot on its seat and bend at the waist. He placed his other hand on her upraised thigh on the chair and let his fingers move around to her front to touch the downy hair between her legs. She moved her hand to touch his and help him play with her hair and lips and clitoris. She arched her back and stood up, and he took his hard cock in his hand and guided it into her, thrusting and pulling away, trying to get as much of himself inside her as he could, and then tantalizingly slipping out of her until he filled her up again. Their rhythm intensified, and he moved his hands to hold her hips. She moved her hands so that he held his between her legs, now wet with her juice, so that she could just touch his hardness as it slipped into and out of her again and again. He thrust into her and moved his hips, changing his attack each time, and she moved her hips to answer him and drive him further. As they moved together and apart, the room was silent except for his moan or her sigh. The rhythm of their coupling increased, and he kissed her neck again. She turned to him and kissed him, luring his tongue into her mouth so that the moment when they came she would have him in her mouth and in her cunt. She imagined that for a second she felt him as deeply inside her arms and legs and back and chest as she did inside her cunt, and she grabbed at his hand and enfolded his fingers in hers to place even more of him within her. And then he came, his cum rushing into her and the muscles of her pussy spasming, clenching him, refusing to let him go. Follet finished the story with her leaning her head on his shoulder. He moved his head to her chest and opened his mouth to suck the soft skin of her breast into his mouth and leave his mark on her. After he had marked her as his, the dream began to fade. The woman stood up from his lap and walked back to the bed, looking over her shoulder deeply into Follet's eyes and smiling, before melting back into her sleeping self.